A tenure professor goes on a podcast show with millions of listeners and details new findings that clearly confirms the predictions of famed American psychic Edgar Cayce. Though Robert Schoch of Boston University didn't mention the psychic by name, anyone familiar with Cayce's work would have instantly recognized the significance of Professor Schoch's statements on the Joe Rogan podcast. It's not every day that you see science and paranormal clash so quickly and significantly in only one night. And I say significantly because we're not talking about the ramblings of some loony psychic attempting to scam you. Rather, we're talking about the readings of possibly one of the most accurate psychics of all times, with information that echoes deep into what many consider to be the true origins of humanity. If true, some of these ideas could pose as a stepping stone to answering some of the deepest questions ever proposed by humanity, such as who are we? Where do we come from? And what does the future hold for us? Not does the information I'm about to share have the potential to unlock secrets necessary for understanding long-held questions like what happened to Atlantis, it's also information that has been concertedly hidden from the public. From my research, it seems that it's not just the UFO reality many Western governments' authorities attempt to hide. It's also the reality behind the biblical stories that seem to be purposely hidden from the public. If you're curious to know what the hell I'm talking about, no pun intended, please stay tuned. Welcome to Second Earth Alternative. This is your host, Felipe Osario. So let's just jump into the topic because this information is unbelievably eye-opening and I wouldn't want to risk losing my audience by talking about less important topics. Also, I wanted to quickly mention that this is only one of a series of episodes that will attempt to not only confirm the existence of Atlantis in West Africa, as many other channels have been doing so lately, but in the following episodes, we will also be discussing the competing theories of what exactly may have happened to Atlantis. Now, if you happened to watch earlier this year a Joe Rogan episode with Boston University geology professor Robert Schoch, you may have noticed that Professor Schoch had made startling comments that seemed to validate the predictions of psychic Edgar Cayce. Now, if you never heard of Edgar Cayce, he is regarded by many as being one of the most predictive American psychics in American history. And many of his readings have come true, such as the stock market crash of 1929, World War II, as well as other minor predictions like the merger of communication companies. So what exactly did Edgar Cayce predict that Robert Schoch confirmed on Joe Rogan? Let's start off by giving you a quick look at exactly what those two are talking about.
What we're talking about for the people that are uninformed is the idea that some of the structures in ancient Egypt are far older than conventional wisdom or conventional modern-day archaeology, modern-day Egyptologists. They would like us to believe that all of this spawned from a very specific time period, and people like John Anthony West and yourself and some other folks like Graham Hancock are proposing that it's entirely possible that there were many different eras of construction in Egypt and that there are some structures that are far, far older than we think.
Yeah, exactly. And this, what I was alluding to, is this really opened up with our work on redating the Great Sphinx.
Yes.
And I think you know the story, but maybe just to summarize in the smallest of nutshells, John Anthony West, before I met him, but he became interested in the work of the late Schwaller de Lubitsch, who passed away in 1961, but he had mentioned in one line that the Sphinx had been weathered by rain. I would say precipitation as a geologist, not wind and sand. So this, if it were true, and it is true, would put the Sphinx back to a much earlier period, which would tie in with Schwaller's work and John Anthony West's subsequent work, that there were indications that dynastic Egypt as we know it, going back to about 3000 BC, was really a legacy of what I call now an earlier cycle of civilization.
So as you see, the Sphinx may indeed predate the pyramids and possibly even the old Egyptian empire itself. But going beyond that, Professor Schoch made startling scientific analysis that seemed to validate some of Edgar Cayce's readings. For example, in one reading, Cayce writes,
"When Ra-Tai and his people arrived in Egypt, they conducted archaeological research. They began to build upon those mounds that were discovered through research. With the storehouse or record house where the records are still to be uncovered, there is a chamber or passage from the right forepaw to this entrance of the record chamber or record tomb.
So just to be clear, Edgar is not just saying that there is a hidden records underneath the right paw of the Sphinx, he's also hinting that the original pyramids were built from a previous mound from priests that were conducting archaeological research on the site and building pyramids on top of their archaeological discoveries. Alright, Mr. Schoch, take it away.
So we started this portion of the discussion with the Sphinx and my initial observations of the Sphinx. And one of my observations was that there's something going on with the weathering and erosion on the Sphinx. The second observation, this is within the first 2 minutes at most, was that the head is too small for the body. The head is not eroded the way the core body is. It's not eroded the way the walls of the Sphinx enclosure are. It's not the original head. See how there's a lioness or a diagrammatic shape over what looks like a facade. Okay, if you then go to the stela that sits between the paws of the Sphinx, you have the same image, much more artistically rendered, of the Sphinx sitting over a facade, over what looks like a building. It's not really a building, it's the archive underneath, I believe.
So you think there's something underneath there?
Oh, I know there's something underneath, because long ago, in the early 1990s, Thomas DeBecke and I, when we did seismic work around the Sphinx, we found the chamber under the paws of the Sphinx.
Now, I understand many people familiar with Cayce may have already suspected that indeed the Hall of Records of Humanity is under the Sphinx. However, it's a whole other thing for a tenure professor to announce it to millions of people based on his own scientific analysis. Not to mention how confident he seems with his assertions.
It's not the original head. It's not the original head. It's not really a building. It's the archive underneath, I believe.
So you think there's something underneath there?
Oh, I know there's something underneath. Oh, I know there's something underneath.
And to think of the funny coincidence that the Sphinx lies in the center mass of Earth. Perhaps it's not a coincidence, but rather an indication of the knowledge that our ancient ancestors possessed. I swear, if this was a Dan Brown novel, the general location of the records couldn't be more obvious. The idea that there is a chamber underneath a paw in the center mass of the world that some scholars might think exists, that a famed psychic predicted, but to this day still not being admitted by authorities? That's pretty astounding. Perhaps even confusing if you're unaware of the amount of suppression that occurs with such evidence. The exact location of the Hall of Records, meaning the right paw of the Sphinx, is not something you can just conjure up with your imagination. But going beyond that, there are other details that matches that are absolutely astounding. For example, check out this reading from Edgar Cayce.
What was the date of the actual beginning and ending of the construction of the Great Pyramid?
Was 100 years in construction, began and completed in the period of Ararat's time with Hermes and Ra.
What was the date BC of that period?
10,490 to 10,390 before the prince entered into Egypt.
Alright, Professor Schoch, please elaborate to the viewers the significance of that date.
Hate to say it this way, but I knew immediately that was not the original head, just from a geological point of view.
Right.
And I believe that's now since been fully confirmed that this is not the original head. It was a recarved head. So for a long time, the question has been, in my mind, and we talk about this even on Mystery of the Sphinx, what was the original head of the Sphinx? What was the Sphinx originally? We've speculated, and other people speculate it might have been a lion, for instance, Leo, because it faces on the equinox the constellation Leo in the sky. Not today, but 10,000 BC or so, more or less at the very end of the last ice age.
And if you think Plato talking about Atlantis, Edgar Cayce, and Professor Schoch are the only ones talking about that general time period, think again. This date also coincides with the younger Dryas, the mini ice age. However, whereas many academics predict that the mini ice age was brought about in decades, if not centuries, recent studies seem to confirm that the mini ice age may have come a lot sooner. Let's listen into another Joe Rogan scientist guest, Randall Carlson, explain why.
It's at 18 degrees, is that what you said?
Up to that.
So
yeah.
the cooling, you're talking about almost that much in
Yeah.
the other direction.
In the other direction. Yes.
God, and you're talking about this over a period of just a few decades?
Well, as we get back this far, we don't have the same degree of precision as we do when we're here. Perhaps, yes, but we're not sure. But we do know that these changes that we're looking at here that terminated the last ice age were just in a matter of a few years. Yeah.
And to back up not only that date, but the concept that the Ice Age was brought to an end very suddenly, here's a recent study published on Göbekli Tepe suggesting that the Vulture Stone is actually talking about a comet strike that occurred. If you didn't guess already, the stone points to a date of 10,950 BC, which takes place right around the younger Dryas. So is it possible that a comet strike may have been at least partially responsible or somehow related to the end of the mini ice age and possibly the destruction of Atlantis itself? And could a similar comet have created the ice age? We think it's possible, but we're going to save the details for a whole nother episode set up to attempt to insert exactly that. So is there more evidence regarding this date? Well, coincidentally, the Hopi Indians have legends of 4 worlds. The first was destroyed by fire, the second world was destroyed by ice, while the third world was immersed in water. Sounds eerily familiar. Given that a relatively large comet had the potential to either create an unusually cold winter via ash or create a flood by melting ice if it were to land on an ice sheet, for example, it's tough to pinpoint if the fiery destruction alluded by Hopi myth is based on a comet. Another possibility is that there were multiple comets coming in contact with Earth in a span of thousands of years that could have been responsible for multiple catastrophes with different consequences based on where the comet landed. Let's listen into why this may actually be a possibility.
Emerging evidence, hard scientific evidence that the human population crashed during the Younger Dryas.
So this would completely coincide with Graham Hancock's ideas about the Sphinx. The Sphinx
Absolutely.
Showing very clear, according to Robert Schoch, Boston University geologist,
John Anthony West,
that there is clear evidence of water erosion in the Sphinx,
Yes.
which would indicate thousands of years of rainfall where there hasn't been rainfall in the Nile Valley since, I believe it was 9,000 BC.
Yeah.
So that's 11,000 years ago. It's
Yes.
all the same stuff.
It's all the same stuff.
God, this is crazy.
Yeah, we're on the verge of a major paradigm shift, and where it's going to go remains to be seen.
We live in a shooting gallery.
Listen, it's not an exaggeration to say that we are sitting ducks in a cosmic shooting gallery. Exactly.
Now, based on the Hopi description, a coronal mass ejection is actually another possibility. There's also the important detail that the Hopi Indian legends hint that the Ice Age may have indeed been created by a geomagnetic pole shift. According to the Hopi Indians' legends, those who have been remembered were saved and taken care of by the Ant people. Once they were safe, the twins of the poles were instructed to leave their posts so that the world would spin off its axis and out of control. And as they traveled through space, it froze into a solid ice until the twins took up their stations again to restore the Earth to life, creating a third world. Now, another interesting detail I wanted to quickly bring up is how the Native Americans mentioned that they were taken to the underground by ant people. Not sure if you're aware, but underground cities have been discovered in other sectors of the world, not just talked about in North American native legends. In fact, there are over 200 underground cities in just the region of Cappadocia, Turkey. One of the largest, Derinkuyu, is 11 levels, not to mention that it was once capable of housing 20,000 people with 15,000 air shafts. Now, given that secret bases like Area 51 with underground installations employs only a fraction of the amount of people that can actually fit inside Derinkuyu, the idea that the Area 51 authorities house their engineers in cities hours away from the base itself, wasting countless research hours due to transportation needs, it makes you ponder a little bit about the engineering feat it must have taken for an ancient Turkish culture to excavate that. And according to the epictimes.com, Although the stone is relatively soft, there has been no evidence of any cave-ins throughout the site, suggesting that whoever built the network had an advanced knowledge of the stonework, architecture, engineering, and the local geography. And to add to that, according to this New York Independent News The Epic Time, the Zoroastrian text, Vendidad, states that Ema built an underground city on the orders of the god Ahura Mazda to protect his people from a catastrophic winter. Now, some say that the winter could refer to an ice age. Wow. So even in Turkey, they talk about an event happening around the Younger Dryas. However, I doubt that winter refers to the older Ice Age years, since the legends are clear that the winter is due to a sudden cataclysm. So if you're to believe the last clip with Randall Carlson that the Ice Age actually occurred suddenly, possibly in just a few days, then the fabled winter referenced in the Zoroastrianism text seemed to make sense to coincide with the sudden beginning of the mini Ice Age.